it's all pretend. The smiles, the lies, the perfect end. The world's a stage, they run the flow. You clap on cue down in the front row. A final shade. Burn bright. You're blinded now, can't see the fight. Smoke and mirrors, they lead the way. Fooling hearts night after day. Welcome to the show, it's all pretend. The smiles, the lies, the perfect end. The world's a stage, they run the flow. You clap on cue down in the front row.
Welcome back, welcome back. All right. Tonight, America in the early 1900s was a land of speed. But what kind of speed? Well, we're going to talk about the speed of innovation, the speed of money, and the speed of the proverbial collapse of things to come. And in the shadows behind the steel and the smoke, another machine or another system was forming, and this is the machine that is basically put into the system today, or put into power today. So this machine made not of gears, but of laws, banks, media, and power. A machine invisible to the workers on Ford's assembly lines. Yes, that's Henry Ford. But very real to the man who controlled the future. And Henry Ford saw parts of that system, not all of it, and certainly not clearly, but enough to feel that he was being hunted or haunted by forces bigger than any one man. So tonight we're going to go deep from the 1910 to around the 1930s. We're going to look at some names, some dates, a couple laws, and some corporations, and the real machinery of corruption behind Mr. Ford's fears. So, if we look at America, and it was built on gears, right? Right after the Industrial Revolution. So we've got the gears of steel, gears of money, gears of belief. Some gears turn the wheels of progress. We were having a lot of progress during this time. And other gears grind people down until all that was left was dust, right? So if you weren't able to make it into this new industrialized system, right? It's a different way of thinking, a different way of living. just wasn't for everybody. So when we look between the 1910s and the 1930s, primarily, around the 1920s is when a lot of this happened. A restless, booming, terrified America, and America drunk on innovation and starving for someone to blame when the system shook beneath their feet. And so when we look at the story of Henry Ford and this industrial titan, and he was a titan for his time, who shaped the modern world, and there was some paranoia that shaped him as well. He was very paranoid about some certain events and some certain people that was taking place during this time. So, and this is not a story of heroes, and it's not really a story of villains, but a story of power. And really, it's a story that we all have to look at ourselves individually, and at what happens when power convinces people that maybe shadows are more real than the facts, and we should really be looking at facts and trying to figure out what is taking place or what has been taking place within history, and not just necessarily relying on the history books, because remember, every history book was wrote by someone, and certain people can put certain beliefs and certain ideals into those books, and that does shape future generations, or it can shape future generations. So let's look at the world that Henry Ford walked into. Okay, so we're going to set this stage here a little bit. So by 1908, when the Model T launched, America was already controlled by industrial dynasties, and those dynasties, we're talking about the big boys at the time. Okay, this is going to be like your Elon Musks and your mine just went blank. The big guys, Palantir, X, Meta, Facebook, things like that. Okay, so these guys would be like John D. Rockefeller, and so what was he famous for? Well, for Standard Oil, right? He owned Standard Oil, a huge oil conglomerate, made tons and tons of money off oil. Then we had Andrew Carnegie, made a ton of money off the steel industry, making steel for railroads and locomotives and vehicles and bicycles and things like that. All the modern stuff that steel would take in this industrial revolution. Then we have J.P. Morgan, which is, he was in banking and he was in railroads and a few other things, so he's kind of got his hands in like everything at the time, okay? Making tons of money everywhere. Then we have Cornelius Vanderbilt, and he was part of the rail system in what drove the railroads, okay? What the trains operated on. And we also have the Guggenheims, which they were big into mining and into metals, okay? So how are we getting those metals out of the ground? That's where those guys came into play. But here's the secret that a lot of history that's not taught in school or from the perspective of the school teacher. So from 1900 to 1910, the decade of quiet consolidation. And remember, our government's supposed to be put into place to stop monopolies. And if you remember back in the 80s, I forget when it was, like 85, 89, something like that, when the government actually stepped in and they broke apart AT&T. AT&T, and then we had multiple different telephone companies that were able to come into power or come into play because AT&T was no longer the only kid on the block, so to speak. It could open the door for Verizon and T-Mobile and some of these other places. So in 1901, J.P. Morgan forms U.S. Steel, the world's first billion-dollar corporation, okay? And so he was buying up these steel franchises, these little mom-and-pop shops everywhere, and making this big conglomerate into what is known as U.S. Steel. 1902, we have the Beef Trust, and so the Beef Trust controlled over 50% of the meatpacking, and that was huge, especially in Chicago, right? Chicago was famous for its meatpacking plants. Then in 1904, we have that the Supreme Court rules that Standard Oil, right, which is John D. Rockefeller, is a monopoly. So what does Rockefeller do? Well, he takes his oil company and he splits it into 34 individual companies that he still owns, right? So, like, it's still a monopoly, but he owns all of these different corporations that's now basically under Standard Oil, okay? And then in 1907, we have the panic of 1907 that nearly collapses the U.S. financial system. This was caused in part by Mr. Morgan orchestrating these panic-like conditions to force Congress into the idea of central banking, okay? And that hasn't happened yet, okay? That's going to come just a few years later, and it will happen. So Ford walked into this, into an America that's already owned piece by piece by a handful of men. And so he really smelled corruption everywhere, in every corner, every nook and cranny. And he wasn't wrong. Like, there's corruption everywhere. Corruption was everywhere at the time. People were being bought and paid for. There's different crime syndicates. The mafia was big then. So, and they all had their hands in the cookie jar. Let's be honest. Okay. So in 1913, and this is a big year, in 1913 the Federal Reserve is born, okay? And this is where the story really takes a turn. So before 1913, we have this special meeting that takes place on Jekyll Island at a private resort off the coast of Georgia, all right? And this was a secret meeting that took place for... basically, you had to have a RSVP. Like, you had to be a special person of a person to be invited to this thing. Okay. And so some of these attendees included Nelson Aldrich, which was the father-in-law to John D. Rockefeller Jr. You had Paul Warburg, which was the twin brother. Okay. And so the thing about the Warburgs, one was, of course, they're both linked to the Rothschilds, okay? But, and we're going to jump ahead here real quick, but in 1913, the Warburg brothers, one was Germany's finance minister, and the other one, Paul, was U.S. Treasury Secretary. Pretty convenient, right? Because what happened shortly after 1913? Well, in 1914, World War I started. Okay, but back to these attendees that were invited to this Jekyll Island meeting. We had Frank Vanderlip, National City Bank, and that bank was a Rockefeller bank, owned by Rockefeller. We had Henry Davison, that was a partner to J.P. Morgan. We had Charles Norton, which owned the first in 1914 or 1910. There we go. I think my thing disconnected there for a second. So these 6 men represented roughly a quarter of the world's wealth in 1910. And so their mission, their sole mission, was to design a new U.S. monetary system that would be privately controlled and publicly masked. Okay? In December 23rd of 1913, the Federal Reserve Act passed, and it was signed by Woodrow Wilson. And later on in his presidential career, he would come to say that because of the Federal Reserve, that he had unwittingly ruined the country. Okay, so that tells you a little bit of something about, once this was all put into play, like, he had second thoughts as to what went down. So what did the Federal Reserve become? Well, privately owned by member banks. Okay, so these members, these people that I just told you about, they basically had ownership in the Federal Reserve. Okay, this conglomerate, this new entity was allowed to print money. They were allowed to set interest rates. They were allowed to lend to the U.S. government. It's kind of weird, right? And was allowed to support corporate banks during certain pandemics. Okay, we're not talking like little mom and pop shops. We're talking about like the big banks. Okay, and so going back to this time, I don't know why my OBS keeps disconnecting here, but hopefully we get it worked out. And so Ford wasn't alone in this, in becoming worried, okay, about central banking. And he started repeating this in like 1914 that this was a huge issue. Thomas Edison also had issues with the Federal Reserve, and he said that if our nation can issue a dollar bond, it can issue a dollar bill. Well, if we look at our dollar bills today, all of them, okay, it's legal tender, but what is wrote on there, right? Basically that it's an IOU per se. Like, there's not really any monetary value in the dollar other than what we give it. Like, it's not backed by anything anymore. Like, they took it off the gold standard in 1971, right? And that's a whole other can of worms there because of what happened there. But there's not really anything that backs the dollar per se. So who's to say the value of the dollar is really a value of the dollar, right? And since 1913 up until today, because the dollar is not backed by anything, it has lost 99% of its face value. Okay? 99%. So that tells you something right there. So going back to Henry Ford. Shortly into 1914, World War I started. Okay? And this is going to feed this system, right? This is going to feed the warmongers. And so between 1914 and 1918, World War I created the largest wealth transfer in American history up to that particular point. Okay, and there were some key players in that. DuPont. They were in charge of making explosives. They were a manufacturer making explosives. And their profits, they're not what they made overall, but just the profits nearly went up 1,000%. Then we have Bethlehem Steel, that were given war contracts by the Fed. Then we have Chase National Bank, which financed the Allied loans. And then we have J.P. Morgan and Company. Of course, this is 4 years later, and he's become extremely influential all throughout the banking sector. Okay, and so he became the official purchasing agent for Britain and France. So Morgan made $30 million in commissions alone in the early 1900s. So Ford saw this, and he became convinced that war was a business and not a tragedy. And one of his famous lines in 1915 was, "The only ones who profit by war are the financiers. Okay, so we look Chase National Bank, JP Morgan, all these big companies like DuPont, Bohemian Steel, Rockefeller, Rothschilds, right? These guys that already have all this money, they're the ones that's making money off this war. Okay? And again, Ford wasn't wrong. Maybe he was just aimed at the wrong targets, so to speak. So now let's take a look at the media. And a little place called the Dearborn Independent. So by 1918, Ford wanted a voice because he couldn't really talk per se in like the newspapers because of his beliefs. So he needed a megaphone. He needed a weapon to fight what he believed was a corrupt world order. And once we start putting all of these pieces of the puzzle together, that's where we have to critically think for ourselves as an individual person and ask ourselves, was this a new world order coming into play? Okay? What is changing? All this money that's changing hands, who's becoming profitable because of this, because of these series of events, and some other series of events that led up to this would be like 1912, the Titanic sinking, and the people that were on the ship and the people that were not on the ship. The ones that were on the ship did not want the Federal Reserve to happen, and the ones that did not get on the ship were the ones that were really pushing for the Federal Reserve to happen. And there's a whole conspiracy theory around that as well. And of course, we said, in 1913, the Federal Reserve was born, but so was the IRS. We changed from a primarily tariff-based income, where the majority of all our government assets was funded by tariffs, into this IRS, which would now tax people based off their income, based off how much you made. Okay, well that's a complete shift right there. 1913, you also have the formation of the Rockefeller Foundation. That's pretty convenient, right? Okay, another piece of the puzzle. We also have the foundation of the American Cancer Society. We also have the ADL that was formed in 1913. Okay, so 1913 was a very, very pivotal year in this transfer of not only wealth, but the power that comes with this wealth and this hidden new world order that would become basically ingrained within all of the United States from that point forward. Okay, so going back to 1918 and Mr. Ford, he ended up buying a newspaper called the Dearborn Independent, and he published that newspaper from 1919 to 1927, and that was like his megaphone. That was his weapon to basically fight, not necessarily for journalism and not necessarily for truth, but for influence. He wanted influence within the society, so that society would see more than just one side of things. Okay, because if all of your media is controlled by one secular group or one particular person, that media is corrupt. You're only getting one side of things. So he wanted to basically influence people on his side and in his beliefs. He wanted to control, the proverbial commas in this newspaper. But that's where the system gets dangerous. When powerful men fear losing control, that they create these enemies. And this, we have to ask ourselves this. And Ford was asking himself the same thing. were there new enemies being made at this time, or was this just Ford being paranoid, right? So Ford was already convinced, and that unseen hands, these unseen hands that we've been talking about, moved the world and turned to an old poisonous narrative, and a narrative that thrived in Europe that was now being repackaged for America. And so he started publishing a series of articles claiming that there was a global conspiracy undermining American values. And so he needed a way to explain the chaos that came from this rapid change that was happening within America at the time. And it was a rapid change at the time. And not so much because evidence proved it, but because fear sells. And we know this today because what did they sell us just a few years ago? Right? They sold us fear through COVID. Okay? Fear itself also organizes people into different groups. Fear simplifies a world that's too complicated to fit into a proverbial blueprint or a factory blueprint. Fear divides those people that normally would come together on certain things. So we look at the bigger story. We're looking at the bigger story here. That media power was already consolidating, just like the steel industry and the oil industry and all of these other industries were controlled by these mega super rich elites. Okay, so the media was consolidating as well. And so by 1920, only 6 families dominated the U.S. news, controlled all the newspapers and all the news that everybody got at the time. Remember, there's no TV, there's no radio, there's none of that stuff at this time. Okay? So we have Hearst, William Randolph Hearst. We have Pulitzer. We have Scripps, McCormick, Oakes, who owned the New York Times. And then we had the Reed family, which had the New York Herald. Okay? And so advertising money, right, that came from in the form of these newspapers, right? Advertising, people advertise all the time, right? It's huge. Advertising is huge. But where did it come from at the time? So we're talking about automotive giants. So automobiles are coming into play at this time. Lots and lots and lots of money from automobiles. Big advertising there. Of course, we've got the oil empires that are growing, that are expanding. We have the railroad companies, massive pull, lots of money at the time. And then, of course, we had banks like J.P. Morgan and National City Bank. And if you think that the media was independent, you got another thing coming. The media was married to corporate power. And so once again, we got to take a step back and we've got to look. So if the media was married to this corporate power, in this duality, in the 1920s, do you not think that the same thing happens today? Yep, pretty much. Okay. So when Ford would publish his controversial articles, and they were pretty controversial at the time, right, the mainstream media would attack. And not out of ideology, but out of corporate loyalty. Like a lot of these newspapers were loyal to who had the money, right? Who's advertising? Who's paying for you to publish your newspapers to get out to the American people that would then sway them one way or the other? It's these big mega corporations. And so Ford believed that this was proof of a hidden conspiracy. What he didn't realize was that many businessmen of every background were entangled in the same system of money and influence, right? and that the system wasn't ethnic, it was institutional. And so you're probably wondering, well, like, what exactly was Ford publishing during this time that was so controversial? For about 3 years, from 1920 to 1922, he published a series of articles that would later be turned into a book that was known as The International Jew. And Ford seen that, or he was starting to put pieces of these companies were either associated with Jews or owned by Jews, in all aspects of not only American banking, but in like the Rothschilds and the Warburgers. So a lot of that was going on, and he's trying to put pieces of this puzzle together. And so that's what he was wanting to publish. So 1920 to 1929 is really a decade of corruption, right? So there's a lot of corruption that's going on. But if we look at like the history books, the 1920s were glamorous, right? Glamorous, like partying and everybody going out to these fancy clubs and dancing and wearing fancy jewelry and these nice fancy suits and dresses. But underneath, it was basically pure systemic rot. And if we look at the Teapot Dome scandal, where the Interior Secretary Albert Fall leased national oil reserves to private companies in exchange for bribes, particularly from Henry Sinclair from the Sinclair Oil Company, and Edward Donaghy, which was part of the Pan American Petroleum Company. And he was really the first major cabinet member that would be convicted of corruption at this time. We have the Florida land boom collapse that happened in 1925, where banks, railroad companies, and developers created massive real estate fraud. And this would later become a dress rehearsal for what would happen in 1929. We have the Pecora Commission reveals banking crimes of 1928. Well, it started in 1928, but it really happened in 1934 or 32 through 34. But the seeds that would lead up to this basically were happening in the 1920s. Okay. And this was because of things like insider trading, market manipulation, bankers selling securities that were basically worthless at the time. And of course you got JP Morgan. Once again, he's got his little fingers in everything, so to speak, giving preferred politicians preferred stock prices to buy influence, right? And that's a key word during this time, is influence, right? The more people that you can influence, the more control you have. The more control you have, the more power you have, and the more power you have, the more money you have, right? And it's this never-ending cycle. So Ford lived in this world of corruption, and he's seen the symptoms. So we have to ask ourselves, was he misinterpreting the cause? Okay, and remember, who or what did he think the cause of all this stuff was? Okay, remember, the International Jew. Okay, and remember, I'm not here to tell you if this was going on or not, right? What Ford was seeing. That's where your critical thinking comes into play, and that's where you need to start putting pieces of the puzzle together, and you come up with your own analysis. Okay, I'm just here to kind of paint this narrative for you into how this system was born and how it has changed over time and how we have gotten to where we are at today. Okay. So Ford's fears versus the real machine. So Ford believed that powerful groups were scheming against America. So the real system was that the banking syndicates manipulated currency and credit, that the industrialists were forming cartel agreements, politicians funded or were funded by corporate money, media moguls were protected or were protecting their advertisers or the people that were paying for the advertisements. Lobbyists were writing legislation that could be passed within parts of Congress, within the House and within the Senate. And then, of course, the courts were siding with wealthy interests or wealthy people that they had interest in. It all sounds very, very similar. Okay? So maybe Ford mistook a class-based corporate financial power structure for something else. But then, was the corruption that he sensed real? Oh, it absolutely was real. And it didn't end. So this corruption has evolved over time. Okay? And there's some other things that kind of goes along with this, in that during this time between 1910 and 1929s, leading up into the 1930s, because of war, it redrew different borders. You would have banks that would collapse overnight and new banks that would spring up overnight. Corporations grew faster than laws could regulate them. Farmers would lose land left and right. Urban crime was spiking during the time, and immigration numbers surged, right? Because we have this huge industrial machine that we have to feed the workers, right? If we don't have workers working, like, this industrial machine is going to collapse upon itself. But what was Ford famous for? Well, Henry Ford, he built cars. And he built cars with mass production. Like, he was the one that really put two and two together into making cars on this assembly line that would later lead into how cars are made in the modern age today. But he would also build myths along the way, and these myths were fueled by fear and by half-truths, right? And we always want to get the truth out. We always want to get to the truth of the matter. And we don't want to blame certain people for certain things if it's only half true. Like, if it's not fully true, then is it true, so to speak? Yet beneath his mistakes, one thing was really true, and it remains true to this day, that America was taken over, not by a person and not by a particular set of people, but we could say by a system. And this system includes things like central banks, corporations, mega alliances, legal loopholes, war profiteers, political puppets. And so this system didn't die, it didn't dissolve, it didn't apologize to anybody. What happened was that it adapted, it survived, and it upgraded into what we see today. Okay? And of course, there's a lot of corruption that's going along the way. There's a lot of greed. There's consolidation of power within these companies whenever they're consolidating. And so the other thing that we have to look at is behind Ford's obsession with certain people happened before. And why is it happening, or why has it happened? Maybe the elites needed a narrative that would distract the public. Maybe they needed a way to simplify complex problems that were happening. Maybe they needed people to unite under a common enemy, so to speak. Maybe it was to keep social unrest pointed away from those that were actually pulling the strings, and I do believe that that still happens today. So when has this ever happened in history, right? Because the neat thing about history is that history always repeats itself. And when we're talking about history repeating itself, remember, we're not talking about the grandeur of history. We're talking about little fine segments within history itself. So Rome blamed Christians. Medieval kings, they would blame heretics. Europe would blame minority for the plagues that would happen. And politicians in every era blame outsiders, right? In all to divide the people. And remember, especially in America, when the people is divided, the people have no power, right? And so Ford himself, he fell into this historical pattern. And it cost him a lot. Like, he wasted a lot of money in lawsuits and backlash and political pressure, especially when he was working with the Dodge brothers. A lot of people don't know this, but Ford actually worked hand in hand with the Dodge brothers, and in return, the Dodge brothers gave Ford money for shares in Ford Motor Corp. And later on, they kind of had a falling out, and Ford things, and then that's how, Dodge Motorsports was built, through this falling out, and Dodge sued Ford in court, and they won, in the tune, I think it was like 18 point something. It was roughly like $19 million at the time. That would go to the proverbial shareholders. And the funny thing was that Ford was the majority shareholder, so he basically paid himself. So I mean, it was kind of stupid. But Dodge did win that court settlement. In saying that what Ford was trying to do, Ford was trying to tank his shares so that the Dodge brothers would leave, because they weren't making money in the company anymore. And the Dodge brothers seen that, and they sued Ford because of that. So yeah, that's a really, really interesting story. But they never got to see the closure because the Dodge brothers would soon die. I don't remember if it was shortly after or right before that court case was finalized. So that was a real interesting rabbit hole to go down. So just remember that we talked about Ford built cars. He also built some myths that were around him. Some were liberating and some were destructive, not only to him but to the time period. His story still stands as a warning. When the world feels out of control, when corruption hides in plain sight, and corruption does hide in plain sight. It's all around us. Sometimes we're just too lazy to call it out. Sometimes we're afraid to call it out. When systems bend to the truth, people look for someone to blame. Anyone. Sometimes even the innocent, right? We blame the innocent for a lot of stuff. And so remember, the system isn't just factories, banks, media, or government. The system can also be fear. And whoever learns how to control that fear really has a lot of control. And like I've said, when have they used that agent recently? During COVID. Okay? So whoever learns how to control fear really controls the system, and in the way that the system is used, and the way that the system is driven, and in what direction and how. So we're going to dig a little bit deeper into this next time. because these gears never stop turning, and I'm always thinking of different and new things to talk about. I'm always reading and watching other people's content and watching videos. And I really think that it's imperative that we learn from history. We learn from our mistakes. We learn what is the system and how it operates so that we can break the system. And with that, we'll see you guys next time. This was Breaking the System.